Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. For the next fascinating hour, we will explore a creative solution to help our state's economy. Even during financial hard times, a lot of money flows through state governments. Property tax payments, sales tax revenue, payroll taxes, fees for licenses, and other revenues arrive at various times. From time to time, the state pays out this money for salaries, equipment, supplies, rent, payment to local governments, and so forth. And so you might wonder what happens to that money while the state has it. The state deposits most of it with the big Wall Street banks and other out-of-state businesses. You might wonder then, why doesn't the state government create a publicly owned bank that would use the money to serve the public interest within Washington state? North Dakota has successfully operated the publicly owned Bank of North Dakota for about 90 years, and North Dakota is the only state that is not currently facing a financial crisis. Our state legislature could create a publicly owned bank and deposit all tax and fee revenue there. The money could be loaned back to small community banks, businesses, farmers, and individuals to serve the public interest in Washington state. And that's the topic that we'll be exploring during this hour. I'm happy to welcome three guests who know a lot about this topic. We have Dan Leahy, Cindy Cole, and John Repp. They're all well informed, and we will have a good time. So welcome to Dan and Cindy and John.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Glenn.
Let's start with some context about the economic mess that we're in. Everybody knows that our country is just really having horrible times financially. And the financial crisis was largely caused by banks that were doing reckless and even stupid things, irresponsible gambling by Wall Street wheeler dealers, and then they crashed the economy. What else can you tell us about the financial crisis that we're in, and especially the banking aspects of it?
I think there's actually two aspects to the financial crisis that we should pay attention to. The first one is that there's been a tremendous amount of federal support for the very banks that created the housing boom and then crashed the economy. They've done that through the TARP program, the $700 billion TARP program.
The Troubled Asset
Relief Program of the U.S. Treasury. They've done it by the Federal Reserve, giving basically funds to those same banks, trillions of dollars actually to those same banks, in exchange for this toxic collateral that they supposedly is worth something. So one of the aspects of the financial crisis is that our federal government is currently continuing to give trillions of dollars to the very institutions that crashed our economy. So on one level, that's the financial crisis. In other words, why is that continuing? And then the second part of the financial crisis is what the American people are paying for that bailout. And they're paying for it in the loss of homes. They're paying for it in unemployment. They're paying for it in continuing foreclosure. They're paying for it in the kind of the crisis of all state governments. For instance, just this week,
in mid-December, as we're taping the program,
there was an announcement that $4.6 to $4.8 billion would be taken out of the state budget. That's a direct result of funds being given to the very people that crashed the economy and not supporting state government in terms of the public services it provides. So I think it's important to look at both aspects of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
And what it really means for businesses in the state of Washington and citizens in the state of Washington is that although these banks have received, especially the large banks, have received such huge amounts of money, taxpayer money, they're still not lending. So credit is extremely tight, and small businesses cannot, some of them have actually gone under because their banks have gone under or they're not lending. And so it's, again, this causes unemployment, higher unemployment, people losing their jobs, therefore losing their homes because they can't pay. It's trickling all through.
Yeah.
We heard a story of a very well-respected business, a pizza parlor, that had 3 or 4 stores. They're rated nationally as one of the top businesses in the country. They wanted to put in a 4th store, and they went to a bank, and the bank said, well, we think restaurant business is very shaky right now. They didn't even look at this business's plan, its success, so they were able to get money somewhere else. I don't think the government keeps statistics on how many people want loans and don't even go to the banks because they don't think they'll get them, or go to the banks and are turned down. But there's a severe shortage of credit right now in Washington State. It's affecting our farmers, our small businesses, and that's where a lot of our jobs come from.
Yeah, all these things are interconnected, and as we move toward the solution part of our program, the idea of a publicly owned bank for Washington State, we'll see that some of the solutions are interconnected too, and that's what makes it fun. Let's figure out how Washington State's banks, the banks that are headquartered in Washington State, have fared during the crisis. Dan, you've done a lot of research on this.
Well, again, I think, Glenn, it's important to look at the banks at the national level first.
Okay.
Like, for instance, the TARP program of the U.S. Treasury, the $700 billion bailout, 81% of those funds went to 17 banks. Those 17 banks has $100 billion or more in assets. So the majority of those funds went to those huge banks like J.P. Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, banks like that, Bank of America. But most of the banks in the country, the thousands of banks, are generally community banks. They're state-chartered banks. They're banks that are chartered by the state government. For instance, in Washington State, there's approximately 86, 87 state-chartered banks in this state. And those are the banks that are under a lot of stress. They're not necessarily under a lot of stress because they engaged in the subprime loan housing market. They're generally in stress because of commercial real estate loans. So in Washington State, there's been approximately 14 bank failures since January of '09. And there's a lot of community banks, I would say approximately 15, 16 more community banks that are in severe trouble based upon a ratio that some people have used called a troubled asset ratio. So I think there's a couple of things. Those banks are, I think, in danger of more collapse because of their investments in the commercial real estate and the downturn in the economy. They're also in trouble because there's not going to be any equivalent TARP program helping them out. They're going to be on their own. So one of the, I think, aspects of the publicly owned bank that we're talking about is the possibility of the publicly owned bank partnering with some of those community banks to help them during this stressful time, but also to generate new lending capacity.
When I introduced the program a few minutes ago, I mentioned that the state government collects a lot of money from taxes and fees and whatnot, and then they put more than half of it out into banks that are headquartered elsewhere, and it seems like relatively little is going into these banks. What information do you have about how much of the money that passes through the state government is really placed elsewhere instead of locally?
Well, I mean, Washington State collects about $10 billion, $10.5 billion in tax revenue for the state. That's not local revenue, that's state revenue. And then they have a list of approximately 93 banks they call public depositories. These are banks that are authorized to receive state funds. They can place, these banks can receive part of that funds collected by the state government. And they did a report recently that said that as of August of this year, 2010, they had collected something like $5 billion. Of that, $3 billion were placed in banks that have headquarters outside of the state. The same banks, for instance, that have crashed the economy, banks like J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and the rest. So, you know, I think a lot of people think that it makes a great deal of sense for the state to think about where they're going to place those deposits in a way that actually benefit people in Washington State.
The inspiration for the effort that you folks are working on comes out of North Dakota, which may come as a surprise to people, but about 90 years ago in 1919, the state of North Dakota created a publicly owned bank that's under control of the state because their people were being abused and gouged by Wall Street and the banks and so forth, especially farmers and other local and small folks. What else can you tell us about the problems that the people in North Dakota were facing then and their effort to get the Bank of North Dakota up and running?
Well, the Bank of North Dakota was generated by a group called the Nonpartisan League that was voted into office in 1919. The reason that these people were voted into office was because the farmers were being gouged by banks in Minnesota, and Minneapolis, Minnesota, and also Wall Street banks. It was a hard battle. There was much opposition from those banks, but they were able to bring it in because the farmers say they would go for a $100 loan, but they would get $69 out of that because they were charged 12% interest and a $20 loan fee. And so the bank was established in 1919. Then they were having a hard time selling the bonds to capitalize that bank. And the Nonpartisan League was put out of office a year later in 1920. But those people who had been so opposed to the bank, they came into office and said, hey, we have a bank. We're gonna keep it and keep it in operation, because they saw that a state-owned bank would be very valuable for the state.
In a few minutes, I want to talk about what some of the successes, the accomplishments have been in the last 90 years. I want to look first right now at Washington State. The three of you plus other people are proposing that Washington State also create a publicly owned bank to remedy the banking crisis that we face here. How might a Washington State bank work, and how could it help Washingtonians?
Well, very similar, exactly identical to the Bank of North Dakota. That's our model. The Bank of Washington State, if that's the name they pick, would take all the deposits of the state, all the tax revenue, the fees. Municipal governments, county governments could also participate, put their money in, and that would be the deposit base. And that money could then be loaned out locally to residents of Washington State, farmers, businessmen. Right? So the state of Washington becomes the banker. It's a publicly owned bank. It would be a member of the Federal Reserve System, which means it would get the cheapest money in the land. It would not have to be a member of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, because the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has a limit of $250,000 for each depositor. And as Dan said, the Bank of Washington, or Washington State deposits daily average of $5 billion, so it makes no sense. So that would give them an advantage. They wouldn't have to pay the FDIC insurance. They would also not be taxed by Washington. But when we talk about this at first, small banks are afraid that, here comes this big competitor. But from the very beginning, the Bank of North Dakota agreed that it needed to support the local banks, not outcompete them or drive them out of business. And that's what it's done. It's been called a mini-Fed. So often the community banks will find the creditor, find the borrower, and the bank will stand behind them, maybe buy half the loan or buy down 1% or 2%. So as a consequence, there have been no community bank failures in North Dakota, because they could see as this crisis was coming up, the Bank of North Dakota stood behind these banks and maybe bought some of their shaky loans. It's the biggest bank in North Dakota. Mm-hmm. It's a strong. It has about $4 billion capital and a $2.6 billion loan portfolio, and it's helped a lot of farmers get started. You know, if you're a poor boy and you want to farm, and you're good at it, you might need a lot of money to buy some land to start a farm. So they do this. They were the first bank to really loan a lot of money to students. So their student loan program was big.
Yeah,
They do loan to
that's a big problem for students nowadays who
Right.
find that they're priced out of the opportunity to go to college because the tuition is so high and then student loans are hard to get. So
Right.
that's a way to
Right.
support yet another constituency.
Right. I will say, to be honest, it took a long time for this bank to really get on to really fulfill its mission, because 1919 was the beginning of a decade of very, very low farm prices. And then the Great Depression came along. But there were foreclosures in the state of North Dakota. The governor in the 30s put a moratorium on the foreclosures. And when the farm prices came back in the 1940s, the Bank of North Dakota sold the farms back to the farmers that they had foreclosed on for the price that they had in it. Now, a private bank wouldn't do anything like that
They
at
also,
all.
if I remember right, John, they also like allowed the farmer to stay on their farms and pay rent
Yes.
Right.
but they didn't necessarily lose it, even though the farm was foreclosed.
Yes.
And then they could buy it back, yeah.
Yeah, they stayed on the farm.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a creative and positive alternative to business as usual.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that we want to see. That
Right.
it helps provide some stability and some resiliency for a local, you know, the rural areas. Otherwise, it crashes and it just takes down the whole rural economy.
I think an important aspect of this to remember is that a state bank would be a nonprofit bank. The business of a state bank would be to develop the economy, to have programs for the public good, and there wouldn't be that problem of having to get a profit to pay off stockholders.
Right.
It would be for the state and for the benefit of
Yeah.
the state and the people of the state.
That's a whole different orientation than saying,
Correct.
how can we exploit these people and suck profits out of that state
Right.
and take those profits back to Wall Street? This is homegrown, and it's how can we
Right.
strengthen our economy and help our people.
Right, keeps our money local.
Yeah.
Keeps our money
Yeah,
local.
localism is one of the things we're going to need to do to cope with the threat of a globalized economy. And also the nonprofit aspect is powerful. That saves you a few percent right there. And also, by having a nonprofit, it would seem like it would also be more economical for the banking services that the state government needs, because they'd be able to get some of their work done at a nonprofit rate rather than
Well, again,
subsidizing profits
if the state owned the bank, then we would not be paying fees for banking services to Bank of America, Wells Fargo. They would be in-house.
Right.
It would all be in-house. So that is, a better use of
Yeah.
taxpayer money.
Yeah. Let's see. How would you propose that this be organized? I know we've talked in preparing for the program about some interesting ways of organizing it, from getting from here to there, but just the bank itself, how would that be, who would run it, and how do we assure accountability? Because we don't have accountability out of the current system. The current
Right.
banking system is not accountable to us, and this would, because we own it.
Right.
So how would you have that accountability and management?
Well, there was a bill last year that was put in the legislature. It got a committee hearing and then died. And it proposed to charter a bank. The state has the power to charter a bank. We're told, we're working with Representative Bob Hasegawa from the 11th District. And he, after talking all year, and he went over and talked to the Bank of North Dakota, the president of the bank, for quite a while. And he came up with the idea of setting up a commission that would then charter the bank. So this bill, it was supposed to drop today. We expect it in a week. This is going to be a tough
Now, that's
legislature.
today as we're taping this program.
That
in
was
mid-December.
December 15th.
Mid-December,
December
right.
15th. Okay. It's going to be a tough legislature, but and this is a long-run project. This isn't going to pull us out of our state deficit in a short period of time. But the idea is to put the legislation and put the basic governance structure in there. The Bank of North Dakota is run by 3 statewide elected officials. We think that's a good idea. That makes it accountable. There would be an advisory board appointed probably by the governor. And then things in there that the mission of the bank is to, ensure commerce and farming and industry in the state of Washington. So it would prohibit any kind of speculation. There's also a very good clause in there, we think, where the lowest official of the state bank would, or the highest official would not make more than 10 times what the lowest official, which is, I think, standard for state government, but obviously not standard for Wall Street banks.
Yeah.
This particular legislation that is being proposed is actually doesn't directly establish a state bank. What it will establish, as written as the outline that we've seen, we haven't seen the final bill, it would create a blue ribbon commission that would be charged with setting up the bank, and that next December of 2011 would then report back to the legislature, and then the bank would be operational by June of 2012. That is actually what our goals are with this particular legislation.
Dan, when we were preparing for the program, you and I were talking on the phone, and you mentioned that this really creates an opportunity for us to rethink, what kind of an economy we want to have for our state. And I like that approach, because so often we just accept the status quo and say, well, let's just do more of the same, or let's do some minor tweaking. But tell us more about what you had in mind.
Well, I think that, one of the real difficulties of the economy today is that finance is completely separated from what you would say the real economy. In other words, finance used to be about investment in plant and capacity, as we used to say in economics class.
Yeah, you build a factory.
You build a factory,
you
produce some things, and that produces wages, hopefully union wages, and that allows people to buy homes and buy products. It allows both the corporation that might be doing that and also the workers to pay taxes, and those taxes provide for public services, for instance, public education and the rest. But over the course of the last 30 years, finance has become completely disconnected from the real economy. They no longer provide financing to the real economy. They make money off the sale of paper, off the sale of kind of like these fictitious debt obligations that they were selling.
Credit default
swaps, all that stuff.
Yeah, it's been referred to as a casino economy.
Casino economy, and they make billions of dollars that stay at the very top. And so there's there's not any production, any creation of a real economy. In fact, what it does is it extracts everything from us. It extracts our wages, it extracts our home values, it extracts our jobs. And so we need to find some way to finance a real economy, one that produces those types of socially useful goods and services. And I think that would be the real function of a state bank. But I also think that a state bank has to have some guidelines of what it, in fact, envisions for a new economy. And I think that's, an important discussion. I actually was talking about that with my son driving up today to your studio. But I think, one of the things that's increasingly important to people is simply good food to eat. And I think there's a lot of small farmers that are struggling to stay in the food production business, something that you can actually eat that's not carcinogenic. And I think there's lots of opportunities for that in Washington State. So, a state bank that promotes that type of small-scale farming that leads to, farmers markets and the rest, that's one thing it could promote. The other thing, there's lots of things about renewable energy I think that it could promote, a lot of things about notions of sustainable economy. But basically, we have to recreate a new type of economy here in Washington State that provides living wage jobs, that is environmentally sensitive, and that will be sustainable. Mm-hmm. But currently, the current economy is not sustainable. That financial manipulation that's going on is impoverishing our entire country.
Right.
And basically extracting all the things that the working class people of this country created. I mean, you can see there right now they're going to extract Social Security. They're interested in taking Social Security because they're basically an extractive economy. What we have to create is really a creative economy.
Right.
One that creates jobs, one that creates in a healthy environment. That's, I think, what we have to establish. And I think the state bank, guided by fiscal policy, is the mechanism that we can use here in this state to do that.
Yeah, we in this country, we have a long heritage of believing in political democracy, and I believe that we also need to have economic democracy, where the people themselves create the kind of economic system that meets our needs, just like the theory is that we do that with the political system. The political system has gotten away from us, and we don't have much democracy there left. We have hardly any democracy at the economic level, but we need to reclaim.
Well, I mean, I think in Washington State there's great examples of that type of democracy, because in the early part of the 20th century, when the railroads dominated Washington State politics, people who were known as populists in Seattle, Tacoma, and in eastern Washington, created this port district. And the reason they created ports is because they wanted to control the price of the commodities that the railroad was bringing over to ship out. And then in the 1930s, when the Eastern monopolies controlled our energy sources, people across the, political lines believed that there was a mechanism that would allow, democratic ownership of public energy resources, and that was the PUDs, municipal ownership. And now you basically have an economy in which finance capital is controlling and extracting all of our wealth, wages, homes, net worth from our homes, and refusing to give us jobs, refusing to give us social benefits. And so in that context, I think it's incumbent upon the state and the people of Washington State to take over that financing mechanism and use our own deposits. It's not as if we're going to ask somebody else. I mean, that money that the state holds is our money.
Right.
So we're simply asking that the state use that money and loan it back to us in ways that will allow us to create an economy that's important to the people of Washington State.
Yeah, when I grew up in Snohomish County, we had the Snohomish County Public Utility District, the Snohomish County PUD. The public in Snohomish County owned the electric utility for the county. And there are those PUDs in a bunch of other counties around the state
21.
and beyond. And where we live in Thurston County, the Puget Power, or under their new name, that got sold out to a big conglomerate that's based by some private owners in Australia. Well, in Snohomish County, we voted for the PUD commissioners. We ran our publicly owned electric company. And now some Australians do it, and we have no recourse. So this is, you look at what happens to our banking system, and here's an opportunity to reclaim some democracy and some control so it serves us and not the other way around. Are there some other things that we could mention about the Bank of North Dakota? When we talked on the phone, some of you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned like the experience during the Depression and so forth. Cindy, you mentioned that the Bank of North Dakota is sort of a clearinghouse that clears local governments' checks. So that's an option, is that local governments could...
Right. We would actually like that for the state, the Washington State Bank also, that they would offer as like a banker's bank, be a mini Fed, but also they could clear checks for municipalities. And the municipalities, counties, cities would have the opportunity to also run their money through the state bank, or they could put it in community banks. That's an option now in the bill. But as far as check clearing, the Bank of North Dakota does that very effectively for their municipalities and cities.
Yeah, I want to add that the profits that the Bank of North Dakota makes, and it loans money to productive citizens and then collects the interest, and that becomes its profits. It returns quite a bit of those profits to the state's general fund. I think in the last 10 years, it's been over $300 million. North Dakota is a quite a bit smaller state. So, and as a result, North Dakota is the only state in the country that doesn't have a budget crisis, a fiscal crisis. Their unemployment is 3.8. Ours in Washington State is 9.2. They have the lowest unemployment in the country. Some people say, well, that's due to other factors. They've got oil and everything. But we read a report that Dan found for us that compared the banking systems and the economies of North Dakota, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Montana. And it showed very clearly that the banking system in North Dakota is much stronger. All the banks are much stronger than the banks in those other states that are small states and also have fossil fuel resources. So it's more than just the fact that they have oil and coal. It has to do with the strength of this bank and what it does for the local banks and the economy.
Yeah. All three of you have told me that other states are looking at North Dakota as a model. Washington is not the only one. There's some others. Can you tell us some of what you've discovered?
Well, Michigan is one of those states. Also, during the last election, there were candidates in Florida and in Oregon that put forth platforms which included a state bank. At the present time in Oregon, and actually Dan, you know quite a bit about this, there's a Working Families Party, and they were able to actually to get a teleconference between community banks in North Dakota and the president and a few other officials of the North Dakota Bank, along with in a teleconference with bankers in Oregon. And they had really a very good conversation, we thought. And it was very interesting to hear how proud North Dakota bankers and North Dakota people are of their bank in this primarily Republican state, and how helpful the Bank of North Dakota is in partnering with small community banks in particular. So Oregon is another state which is working on. Idaho, we understand, is also working on a state bank.
Yeah, it seems like a kind of a practical, populist kind of solution that doesn't need to get bogged down by saying, oh, that sounds like socialism. Don't put a label on it. It works. And people in these various states, some of which are kind of Republican-oriented or politically conservative, are doing it, and they love it. And so I would hope that viewers would not think of labeling, but just say, let's do something that's practical, that really works and meets our needs.
You know, if I could
democracy.
just tell a short story. I interviewed a person named Ivan Compton, who was a Republican legislator back in the 1930s. He was from Wenatchee, Washington. He was an orchardist, and I suppose someone we would think of as conservative socially. And he was elected at the same time as Warren G. Magnuson. They met each other in the state legislature, and there was one thing they agreed upon. They agreed upon the public's right to use eminent domain power to condemn the property of private monopolies and take it over for public ownership. Now, Ivan Compton didn't think anything about that other than he thought it was a really good idea.
Yeah.
And he was a made leader of the creation of the Chelan County PUD in Wenatchee, based in Wenatchee, Washington. So, I mean, I think I think Americans are economically very practical.
Yeah.
And right now they're in a lot of trouble. And they have to find some way of breaking this stranglehold on lending. And they need to be able to create an economy that employs them, provides them with housing, healthcare system, and educates their kids. And we have the resources available to us in Washington State. We have our deposits, and we could capitalize those deposits by issuing a general obligation bond, just like the state treasurer always does. and we could set up our own bank and begin, creating our economy here that's, kind of intra-Washington state, that keeps the income, keeps the resources, keeps things turning over within the state boundaries. And I think that's a very practical solution. There's nothing else, there's nothing on the horizon that's going to help people in Washington state that I can see. They're going to suffer more unemployment. The small businesses and even the banks are going to continue to fail unless something happens. And I think we have to draw upon our kind of populist heritage and think about running things ourselves.
I've been doing a lot of reading of the transition towns movement and so forth, the relocalization of stuff, whether you look at food, locally produced food instead of shipping in food from across the world,
On a truck.
all these things. Localizing is going to be a lot more resilient, a lot more sustainable, and here's an opportunity to do that in the economic realm. How did you folks get into this? John, Cindy, Dan, what hooked you into this?
That's kind of interesting.
And we want to be kind of brief.
Right.
Yeah.
When the banks crashed in 2008, Cindy and I were invited to join a discussion group set up by the Seattle Fellowship of Reconciliation. And we did, and we started doing all the reading we could to try to understand this crisis. And there were a number of us in that group who were also very concerned about climate change and peak oil and these issues, so that we saw ourselves as in an ecological crisis as well. And in the course of reading, I came across an article in Yes Magazine in December of 2008 by a woman named Ellen Brown, and Ellen Brown has written many articles that are available in Huffington Post and all over the internet about state banks. And I think the title of the article was How to Finance a New Deal. And I thought this was a great idea, so I told the people in our study group about it. And about a year later, Mike Yarrow found out that Bob Hasegawa, that's representative that we're working with, had been talking about a state bank too. So he said, let's go meet him. And so we talked to him, and I was spouting off what I had read, and Bob was up against a deadline. He didn't have a bill written yet, and I guess he thought I knew what I was talking about. So he said, why don't you write a bill for me? So what do? I panicked. I Googled how to write a bill. I got a 7th grade teacher's lesson plan. And I pulled Cindy in. We had the sense to email North Dakota and get the law in 1919 that set up their bank, and that was our template. So we wrote a bill, and the first page was nothing but, this is a way to finance a sustainable economy. That was our emphasis. The rest of it was like, followed the template of North Dakota. So Bob took this and took it down to Olympia, and of course the staff rewrote it. Even he now agrees they didn't understand it as well as we did. And in the course of the year, they've come up to speed, he says. But that's how we got involved, and it's been lots and lots of people are coming forward in lots and lots of ways. And to me, it just shows that you can have some curiosity, do some studying, start talking to legislators. That's the good thing about the state. The legislators are accessible.
Yeah.
And some of them, are willing to learn and listen to this.
Yeah.
What we really need is those Republicans. We need some Republican legislators to stand up and understand that the bank over there in North Dakota is supported by the Republicans. It's practical, and it needs to be a nonpartisan issue here.
Right. And Dan, your interest goes back like 1979.
Yeah.
Were interested when Senator King Lyson was.
Senator
working
King Lyson was a great senator in this state. He was
And we see him now and then at
He was a great guy.
Fellowship of
And I
Reconciliation
knew
events.
both him and his wife, and I remember that bill. In fact, when I started getting interested this time, I actually went back to my files and I actually found the proposed piece of legislation in 1979 that I still had in my files. And so that was, an early interest. And then, of course, I knew the history of the Nonpartisan League and the banks and their idea of creating, if you're going to create a new society, a new economic order, you have to have your own financial mechanism. And they weren't just interested, in having a bank. They were interested in financing a new social order in North Dakota that would allow people to survive, farmers and others. And I guess the thing that got me really interested this time was the $700 billion bailout of those large banks, and I wanted to see some of that money come down and help the American homeowner that was facing foreclosure, and I never saw it.
Right. Or the local community banks that are rooted in the community and serve the community, and they're excluded from that money that went to the big.
They certainly are excluded. But I think it's also, by the way, I wanted to mention that the state bank also has a relationship with the credit unions. Yes. And credit unions are in North Dakota, and credit unions are very important, along with the community banks. And there's many really great community banks in this state that, stayed out of speculative business. They stayed out of, disastrous real estate commercial activity. And they've stayed, really true to their mission of serving their local community. But the credit unions are also important.
Yeah, and again, it's a member-owned democracy.
It's a member-owned, it's a cooperative, and
One of the things that we've sort of touched on a few times during this program thus far is how many different kinds of people can resonate with this. Farmers, students, homeowners, community bank people, small businesses, this and that and everything else. It's the kind of thing that's so much fun to organize because you can generate a lot of strategic allies, people that you don't normally work with on an issue, but this is in everybody's interests, everybody except the big banks, and they would certainly be opposing it. But I can imagine organizations of farmers supporting this. I can imagine organizations of university students supporting this. I can imagine small businesses, local chambers of commerce, local banking industries, all kinds of people. It's the kind of thing that everybody can gather around and say, this is going to help. And certainly environmentalists and people working for local sustainable practices throughout their ecosystems or throughout their local communities. It's a natural.
I think those constituencies have to be organized, and they have to, set up their own, just like FOR did, their own study groups.
Yeah.
They need to look at this and to learn about the banking system in Washington State, and
Yeah, you mentioned the bill that you're working on to introduce in the January 2011 legislative session. What are some other next steps that you're looking at? A House bill thus far? There's not, as we tape this program in mid-December of 2010, there's not yet a Senate bill. Right. Is that right?
That we know of.
That you know of.
Right. It would probably, the Senate bill would probably mirror, at this point, would mirror the House bill.
Right. They often do companion bills, so they just take the same wording, and wherever it says House, change it to Senate.
To Senate.
And that makes it easy to come together.
Right.
If it makes it through both bodies.
That is the plan at the moment.
Yeah, so we'd be looking for state senators to...
Yes, right. And we have, actually, John and I are going to go to the office of state senator tomorrow. We've also spoken with Sharon Nelson of the 34th District as a possible senator to help sponsor the bill.
So another part of getting the thing up and running would be to get the capital, and I don't mean the building at the middle of Olympia, but I mean the capital meaning the money, the resources, the financial resources, to capitalize the bank, to provide the body of funding that the bank would be using. What are some, how do you anticipate possibly doing that? We've mentioned a little bit about that, but tell us some more about how to get the money together to be a bank.
Well, I think, it's not very likely because of the state deficit, but the legislature could, from its general fund, start a bank. But because there's such a deficit now, the most likely possibility is, as Dan mentioned earlier, general obligation bonds. Now, that means, of course, that it would take a little longer for the bank to start really coming into its own and being able to pay back the general fund, but that seems the most practical way. We've seen the studies of possible bank in Oregon, and that's the way they looked at it.
One of you mentioned to me on the phone when we were preparing for this that the state actually has a lot of assets, buildings and
Right.
highways and things that you might think of as maybe assets that provide the basis from which you could loan
Yeah.
money. Is that feasible or is that
That's
too
been a
creative?
suggestion. We have spoken with some representatives and legislators about that, and they shy away from that. But it would be possible for the state of Washington to use the highways that it owns, the buildings it owns, the land that it owns as collateral, as a capital base.
A former Republican representative, I don't know if I can mention his name, Brian Derdowski, thought that was a very good idea. He was down at the hearing last year. So this has been written about on the internet as a way to capitalize the bank, and it would be a very, the amount of capital that the state of Washington has is huge, and so it would make it for a very strong bank.
Yeah.
They would still have to use this tax money that's flowing through it
Right.
as their actual cash reserves. So my hunch is, this is going to be up to the Blue Ribbon Commission, but my
Right.
hunch is they'll go with general obligation bonds.
And that sounds like a smart way to go. Create a commission who can really look at all these things and figure out, is this feasible? How well could this work? And come up with the best proposal. So that's an exciting thing. How could people learn more about this? I've been learning some just lately based on things that the three of you have told me in preparing for the program. What sources of information do you recommend? I did read Ellen Brown's article from 2008. It was very informative. I want to read more of her stuff.
Right. She has a blog where she's writing articles almost weekly, not just about the state bank, but often at the end of the article, she mentions the state bank as a solution to many of these problems. So she has a blog. So if you Google Ellen Brown and her blog,
Also,
the Bank of North Dakota has a website you can visit.
You can actually Google or use whatever kind of search method you do to just go for Bank of North Dakota. And also, one of you told me about go through YouTube. There are
Yes.
several short videos, so you can go to YouTube and then just do search Bank of North Dakota.
Right.
And there's some.
That's a good one.
I think it's also, the Working Families Party of Oregon has been studying, the idea of a state bank in Oregon for at least a year and a half. And they've developed, an enormous amount of really good Q&As and information about state bank and questions people might have about a state bank. So I'd encourage people to get a hold of the Working Families Party of Oregon, too.
Okay. And then the website for the study group that you folks worked with, justsustainableeconomy.org,
yes.
has a little section. You go to the website and right at the top there's a thing you can click on that says State Bank and learn about it. So justsustainableeconomy.org. And once the bill gets introduced, people can go to leg.wa.gov. That's the state legislative website, and just do the search on State Bank. But it's
we will also, when the bill does get dropped, we want to have that link on our JUICE website also.
okay. JUICE is your Just Sustainable
Just Sustainable Economy. Yeah.
And we also, at the end of the program, I give the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation phone number and website, and people can contact us, and we can follow up and provide the links and things.
Great.
What would you like to see people do to help out with this effort?
Well, do what we just talked about, inform themselves a bit, and then go talk to their legislators, their state representatives, and their state senators. It's amazing to me, frankly, how little these representatives know about banking. Not many people do.
People don't know about banking.
I didn't know
No,
much
don't.
myself.
Yeah, it's a very
Right.
way out there thing that most of us
Right.
Yeah, people should invite John and Cindy to come to their community.
do that. Yeah, because you folks have just really studied up on this for a few years now, and I'm glad that we have you as available. They come down from West Seattle
I
to
mean,
Olympia for
every
this.
Rotary Club should invite them. Every Rotary Club in Washington State should invite them to come and talk about a state bank.
Yeah,
What
or
about
you.
you, Dan?
Or me, I could come. I love talking to the Rotary,
Yeah.
actually. So
Great.
But and then also, besides talking to the House and Senate members at the state level, talk with groups that ought to be a natural constituency that would
Right.
want this.
If you know people that are business people.
Yeah.
If you know bankers.
Community
say,
bankers.
hey, you know, I've
Farmer
heard about
groups,
this. Farmer groups.
groups that work on sustainability.
And once you get some information, put it out on your blog or put it, you know, get out on the internet. There's
There's a lot of,
different
yeah,
blogs.
there's a lot of people that, you know, are credit union members,
Yeah.
like our family. They should go
Yeah.
ask their credit union
Yeah.
about what their position is about the state bank
Yeah.
and how, or even their community banks. Like I bank at Heritage Bank here in Olympia, Washington. And I've, you know, been interesting correspondence actually with the president of that bank. And so
Okay.
about various things. And so I think it's important we talk to them directly, but also, you know, all your constituencies, whatever group you, because they really, you know, we're constantly told that there's no way except for giving more money to these large banks. And that's not, I think that's wrong. There's a way out of it, and I think a state bank, based upon really good fiscal, you know, policy guidelines, is a possible way out of it.
Yeah, more of the same is not going to get us out of the problem,
It's
because
not.
the same is what got us into the problem, and more of the same is just more of the same. And this is a very exciting and fresh alternative that I think is quite workable. I wonder, could we get a closing thought from each of you? It's been a great presentation, great conversation. If we can pick up something from each of you, we can wrap this thing up and send the people on their way.
Well, I just think this is a very good idea that the state of Washington should have its own bank.
I would say just to remember that it is a nonprofit bank and it's for it is for the benefit of the people of Washington. Could really benefit our state.
I think we have to remember our history. We fought the railroads and won. We fought the electric monopolies and won. And I think we could fight Eastern Finance and win and create a state bank.
All right.
That's what I think.
Well, I want to thank Dan Leahy and Cindy Cole and John Repp. I want to thank all
you,
the
Glenn.
folks who've been watching. A lot of our tax dollars flow through the state treasurer's office, which lends them to the nation's biggest banks for Wall Street's wheeler dealers to do who knows what with. And they extract profits from our money. They use our money to play their games that often go sour, and then we end up holding the bag on that. I'm just very much excited by the prospect of a publicly owned bank for our own state that keeps our money local, keeps our money out of the hands of the greedy big out-of-state banks, and uses that money for productive purposes at home for farmers, students, small businesses, communities to be resilient during these hard times. The choice really seems obvious that working for a state bank is a solution to, not the only solution, but one of the important solutions for what we're facing in this fiscal crisis. So I encourage people to do what you can. Beyond the topic we've been talking about during this hour, you can get information about a lot of other issues that relate to peace and social justice and nonviolent social change by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093. Visit our website, www.olympiafor.org. There's information about a lot of things there, and I think you'll find some interesting and enjoyable content. We're all one human family. We all share this one planet. We can create a better world, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks. knows that our country is just really having horrible times financially. And the financial crisis was largely caused by banks that were doing reckless and even stupid things, irresponsible gambling by Wall Street wheeler dealers, and then they crashed the economy. What else can you tell us about the financial crisis that we're in, and especially the banking aspects of it?
I think there's actually two aspects to the financial crisis that we should pay attention to. The first one is that there's been a tremendous amount of federal support for the very banks that created the housing boom and then crashed the economy. They've done that through the TARP program, the $700 billion TARP program.
The Troubled Asset Relief.
Troubled Asset Relief Program of the U.S. Treasury. They've done it by the Federal Reserve, giving basically funds to those same banks, trillions of dollars actually to those same banks, in exchange for this toxic collateral that they supposedly is worth something. So one of the aspects of the financial crisis is that our federal government is currently
Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. For the next fascinating hour, we will explore a creative solution to help our state's economy. Even during financial hard times, a lot of money flows through state governments. Property tax payments, sales tax revenue, payroll taxes, fees for licenses, and other revenues arrive at various times. From time to time, the state pays out this money for salaries, equipment, supplies, rent, payments to local governments, and so forth. And so you might wonder what happens to that money while the state has it. The state deposits most of it with the big Wall Street banks and other out-of-state businesses. You might wonder then, why doesn't the state government create a publicly owned bank that would use the money to serve the public interest within Washington state? North Dakota has successfully operated the publicly owned Bank of North Dakota for about 90 years, and North Dakota is the only state that is not currently facing a financial crisis. Our state legislature could create a publicly owned bank and deposit all tax and fee revenue there. The money could be loaned back to small community banks, businesses, farmers, and individuals to serve the public interest in Washington state. And that's the topic that we'll be exploring during this hour. I'm happy to welcome three guests who know a lot about this topic. We have Dan Leahy, Cindy Cole, and John Repp. They're all well informed, and we will have a good time. So welcome to Dan and Cindy and John.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn.
Let's start with some context about the economic mess that we're in. Everybody continuing to give
trillions of dollars to the very institutions that crashed our economy. So on one level, that's the financial crisis. In other words, why is that continuing? And then the second part of the financial crisis is what the American people are paying for that bailout. And they're paying for it in the loss of homes. They're paying for it in unemployment. They're paying for it in continuing foreclosure. They're paying for it in the kind of the crisis of all state governments. For instance, just this week,
in mid-December, as we're taping the program.
mid-December, there was an announcement that $4.6 to $4.8 billion would be taken out of the state budget. That's a direct result of funds being given to the very people that crashed the economy and not supporting state government in terms of the public services it provides. So I think it's important to look at both aspects of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
And what it really means for businesses in the state of Washington and citizens in the state of Washington is that although these banks have received, especially the large banks, have received such huge amounts of money